Well, several years ago, a group of American students were taking a basic course in zoology and were told by their professor that at the end of the week there was going to be a specific exam on the subject of birds. And so one of the students says that all that week he studied both day and night, trying to learn everything he could about these birds. He says he studied up on where they lived, the countries that they came from, what they ate, how they mated, just about everything and anything that he thought might come up in this exam. Well, finally, the day of the exam arrived, and so he went to his exam room, where he noticed that down the front of the classroom was this massive perch which had on it uh, these 10 dead birds, all lined up, except that every bird was covered over, so that the only part of each of these birds that you could see was that of their legs. Well, no problem, he says. He just assumed that once the professor arrived, that he would simply uncover the birds and that the exam would then begin. Except that, to his surprise, the college professor arrived at the classroom and then walked to the front of the room, where he then stood beside these birds and told the students that, look, what we have here are 10 birds. He says they're all covered over. However, what I want you to do is to look at just their legs, nothing else. Just look at their legs, and then try and work out what type of bird is under each of these covers, and then two, how much can you tell me about each of these birds in the next hour and a half? Well, at this point, this bloke's beginning to think to himself, this is a stupid exam. He's thinking, I've been up day and night studying for this exam, and now you're going to just show me 10 pairs of legs and expect that I can somehow tell you everything I know about these 10 birds, which I cannot even properly see. And so he says he sat there for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, until finally he's thinking to himself, this is absolutely useless. He says, there's no way I can do this exam. And so he gets up from his desk, he grabs his bag, and storms his way to the back of the room whilst yelling out to everyone that this is the dumbest exam ever. However, he says that as he's storming out, he could hear his college professor yelling after him, but he says he was so angry that he simply ignored him and continued storming straight out the room until finally the college professor yelled out, young man, he says, young man, stop right there. Young man, what is your name? At which point this student now stops walking, and he says he turned around, he looks at his professor, pulled up his trouser leg and said, here, professor, you tell me. Now, I tell you that story because in one sense, that's exactly how many people feel when they come to the book of Ezekiel. And who could blame it? I mean, it's a difficult book. In fact, one bloke by the name of John Calvin, who spent nearly 30 years teaching his way through the entire Bible, and who wrote a commentary on just about every single book of the Bible, except I think maybe two, he had to admit that when he came to this particular part of the Bible, he had absolutely no idea as to what it means. And again, who could blame him? I mean, the book itself is so full of strange visions and pictures and concepts which just seem so utterly incredible and out of this world, that even Ezekiel himself has to say repeatedly that what he saw was, quote, like, or had the likeness of, or had the appearance of, and so forth. It's almost as though even Ezekiel himself was struggling to find the right words in order to describe what he was seeing. So then what is the book about? Well, let's start by looking at the opening three verses. Just there in Ezekiel chapter 1, verses 1 through 3, he tells us this, that in the 30th year, or in my 30th year perhaps, in the 4th month, on the 5th day of the month, as I was among the exiles by the Keba Canal, the heavens were opened, and I saw visions of God. On the 5th day of the month, it was the 5th year of the exiled King Jehoiakim, the word of the Lord came to Ezekiel the priest, the son of Buzi, in the land of the Chaldeans by the Keba Canal. And the hand of the Lord was upon him there. Well, let me just give you some background information to try and put things in the right order for you. And basically, the Bible is just like any other book, in the sense that it has a beginning, it has an end, and it has a middle. But the other thing is that from beginning to end, the Bible, like any other book, also has this one big story running through it, this one main narrative. And the big storyline of the Bible, if you like, is the story of God's people living in God's place and living under God's rule or blessing, and of how God ultimately causes that to happen through the person of Jesus. So, for example, at the very beginning of the Bible, it starts by telling us of how God created the universe and everything in it. He created all things, whether physical or spiritual, visible or invisible, from the largest galaxy to the smallest atom. God made it all. Furthermore, he also created people, including the first man and the woman, created them in his image and for a special relationship with himself. And then he puts them in this good place within his creation, and says to them in effect that, look, if you listen to my words, if you trust me, if you obey me, if you trust what I'm telling you, then these are the ways in which I'm going to bless you and seek your good. However, if you reject me and my words, if you disobey me, then this is what will happen. One, you will be out of right relationship with me. Two, you will eventually die, both physically and spiritually, because you will be separated, as it were, from me. And three, I will put you out of this good place that I have created for you, which in Genesis is a garden. It doesn't take long at all to realize that people aren't going to listen to God, they're not going to trust him. And so pretty soon we find the people out of relationship with God, we find them destined to die, we find them at war with God and with one another. We find that the world itself has now become a broken and sometimes hostile and dangerous place to live. And then, of course, the story of the Bible from that point on is all about how God is going to bring them back into this good place. But one of the ways in which he does that, this idea of God's people in God's place under God's rule or God's blessing, is a recurring theme throughout the Bible. You see it firstly, as we said, just there in the garden, right at the very beginning of the Bible. You see it at the end of the Bible with the kingdom of God. The kingdom of God, God's people in God's place under God's rule. But in between the beginning and the end, you have, in the middle, as it were, this concept of the promised land. A picture of what the Garden of Eden was supposed to have been and of what the kingdom of God will be. And so in this place, the promised land within the Old Testament, it was supposed to function as this picture of God's people in God's place under God's rule. As we said, kind of what the Garden of Eden was supposed to have been, but also a picture of what the kingdom of God will be, except that the people in the promised land did the same thing that the people in the garden had done. And that is, it doesn't take long at all to realize that they're not going to listen to God either. And so, as with the first man, they find themselves put out of the promised land, as it were, which is where we're up to as you come to the book of Ezekiel just here. By this point, we find a man who's now been ripped away from his home, his family, his land. He's been carried off into captivity and into exile in a foreign land. He's no longer in this good place that God intended for him and his people. And so basically what had happened was around about 604 BC, the nation of Babylon had invaded the southern kingdom of Israel, which at that time was known as Judah. They sacked Jerusalem, they destroyed the temple, they captured the king, and then they take this remaining group of people who hadn't been killed into captivity and into exile in Babylon. And so now with their families torn apart, their homes destroyed, their country in ruins, and now living as captives in a foreign land, Ezekiel begins in verse 1 by telling us that in the 30th year, in the 4th month, on the 5th day of the month, as I was among the exiles by the Kiva Canal, or in other words, if you want to put it into modern speech, you're saying on the 31st of July, in my 30th year, I was with the Judean exiles beside the river Kibar in Babylon, and things were not good. They're not good. Verse 3 tells us Ezekiel was a priest. And in verse 1, he's probably about 30. I mean, in some versions it says it was the 30th year. Others, it's translated as in my 30th year. I'm not sure which is correct. I tend to go with the second one. Perhaps it's that Ezekiel was 30. He's a priest, and at the age of 30, he would have just been getting ready to serve in the temple. Except that this massive event has now happened, this massive upheaval, where he's been ripped from his land and from the temple and from the city of Jerusalem. And I'm sure he must have been thinking to himself in this moment that this is not the way that I imagined my life going. Where is my family? Where are my friends? Where is God in the middle of all this mess? And what has happened to my home? What will happen to me now? Does God even know? Does he even care anymore? And yet notice how it's in this very place that Ezekiel comes to experience and to witness three incredible truths about God. Firstly, he tells us in verse 1 that in my 30th year, in the 4th month, on the 5th day of the month, as I was among the exiles by the Keba Canal, the heavens were opened. Or in other words, it's as though someone removed, as it were, that invisible barrier between heaven and earth. They pulled back the curtain, as it were, so that Ezekiel could see what was actually happening in heaven itself. He's given a vision of the very presence of God and what it is that's happening in the heavenly places. And he says that as this curtain is torn back, as it were, he says, I saw visions of God. And then secondly, he goes on to tell us in verse 3 that not only did he see visions of God, but also that it was here that the word of the Lord came to Ezekiel. The word of the Lord came to Ezekiel. And then lastly, not only does he see a vision of God and hear the very word of God, but also in verse 3, it's in this very place of exile and hardship and suffering, and in this very place where he least expects God to be, that he says the hand of the Lord was upon him there. The hand of the Lord was upon him there, in that place, the place that he least expected God to be. And I think that this one word, it is this one word which probably captures the amazement of this moment more than any other. Namely, as Ezekiel is sitting there as a prisoner and exile in this foreign land, feeling alone and separated, far from God, maybe even abandoned, separated from his family and friends, ripped away from everything which seems good and right and normal, literally as a refugee living in a camp beside a canal in Babylon. And yet is here in this place that God, the Lord Almighty, creator of heaven and earth, ruler over all things, whether visible or invisible, it's here in this place that God makes himself known to you. So that God is there, even in Babylon. And that is a comfort. That's a comfort to know that God is in that place too. You know, I was going through some notes just recently, and I realised I'd actually preached on this passage a couple of years ago, and in the very week that I had preached through it in a different church, in that week alone, we had in our church at least 3 people who were waiting for test results from cancer. We had 5 people in hospital. We had 3 older couples whose adult children at that time were going through a divorce. We had 2 people in abusive relationships. We had 1 person with a grandchild who was in the process of being kicked out of home, or had just been kicked out of home by their parents, which were this older couple's children. At least 2 people with family members outside the church who were in hospital. Another with a family member facing court. That's just the ones I knew about just that week. However, this is the first and main point that I want to make. That is that God is there. Wherever you're at, whatever it is that you're going through, God is there, and he hasn't abandoned you. In fact, I remember seeing this Mel Gibson movie a couple of years ago called We Were Soldiers. And it tells the true story of Lieutenant Colonel Hal Moore, who was given the responsibility of training and then leading a battalion of some 400 men into battle, the Battle of Ladrang during the Vietnam War. It was an extraordinary story, but he led a battalion of 400 soldiers who found themselves unexpectedly confronted by an opposing army of more than 4,000 men. However, given that this is one of the first wars to really utilise helicopters during battle, in order to both deploy and evacuate troops, Lieutenant Colonel Hal Moore had made this promise to his men. He had said to them that when the helicopters land, I will be the first man to step onto the battlefield, and I will be the last man off the battlefield, and I will leave no man behind. That's his promise. When the helicopters land, I'll be the first man onto the battlefield, I will be the last man off the battlefield, and I will leave no man behind. Well, the battle was fierce, lasted for 4 days, massive casualties on both sides, and neither the documentary or the movie are easy viewing. But the most remarkable thing for me, I think, was the example of Lieutenant Colonel Hal Moore, who, true to his word, was the first man out of the helicopter, and who then refused to leave the battlefield until every man, whether dead or alive, was fully accounted for and then removed from the battle. Only then did he step off the battlefield and then back onto a helicopter. But it's an extraordinary example, I think, because in one sense, that is what God is like. So whatever battle we have to face, and let's face it, let's be honest, there are hundreds of battles and hardships and difficulties which at some time or another we're going to have to go through. And yet, not only does God promise to be with us in that moment, but he also has promised to go before us. So that when the battle does come, we will find, one, that God himself is already there. Two, that he will not leave us or abandon us in the thick of the battle or the trial. And three, that he's not going to step off that battlefield until we ourselves are in some way or another delivered and rescued out of that battle or trial. That's God's promise to us. A God who promises that he will never leave or forsake his people. But who is this God who promises to be with us at the beginning and at the end and at every moment in between? Well, have a look with me at verses 4 through 25. Ezekiel says this. He says, as I looked, behold, a stormy wind came out of the north, and a great cloud with brightness around it, and a fire flashing forth continually. And in the midst of the fire, as it were, gleaming metal. And from the midst of it came the likeness of 4 living creatures. And this was their appearance. They had a human likeness, but each had 4 faces, and each of them had 4 wings. Their legs were straight, and the soles of their feet were like the sole of a calf's foot. They sparkled like burnished bronze. Under their wings on their 4 sides they had human hands, and the 4 had their faces and their wings thus. Their wings touched one another. Each one of them went straight forward without turning as they went. As for the likeness of their faces, each had a human face. The 4 of them had the face of a lion on the right side, the 4 had the face of an ox on the left, and the 4 had the face of an eagle. Such were their faces. And on their wings were spread out above, Each creature had 2 wings, each of which touched the wing of another, while 2 covered their bodies, and each went straight forward. Wherever the Spirit would go, they went, without turning as they went. As for the likeness of the living creatures, their appearance was like burning coals of fire, like the appearance of torches moving to and fro among the living creatures. And the fire was bright. Now the fire went forth lightning. The living creatures darted to and fro like the appearance of a flash of lightning. Then as I looked at the living creatures, I saw a wheel on the earth beside the living creatures, one for each of the 4 of them. As for the appearance of the wheels and their construction, their appearance was like the gleaming of beryl. The 4 had the same likeness, their appearance and construction being as it will, a wheel within a wheel. And when they went in any of their 4 directions without turning as they went. Their rims were tall and awesome, and the rims of all 4, were full of eyes all around. When the living creatures went, the wheels went beside them, and when the living creatures rose from the earth, the wheels rose. Wherever the Spirit wanted to go, they went. The wheels rose along with them, for the spirit of the living creatures was in the wheels. When those went, these went, and when those stood, these stood, and when those rose from the earth, the wheels rose along with them, for the spirit of the living creatures was in the wheels. Now over the heads of the living creatures there was the likeness of an expanse, shining like awe-inspiring crystal, spread out above their heads. And under the expanse their wings were stretched out straight, one toward another. Each creature had 2 wings covering his body. And when they went, I heard the sound of their wings like the sound of many waters, like the sound of the Almighty, a sound of tumult, like the sound of an army. When they stood still, they let down their wings, and there came a voice from above the expanse over their heads. When they stood still, they let down their wings. Well, someone somewhere once said that how we think about God and what we think about God are 2 of the most important things about us, because how and what we think about God will determine how we live more than any other thing, which is why we need Ezekiel in our Bible. I mean, what a vision he has. Firstly, he sees in verse 4 a storm coming from the north, and then within the storm, verse 5, something which appears to be these 4 living creatures, and which we know from elsewhere are cherubim, which are these kind of angelic messengers of God. However, forget about your Christmas cards with baby cherubs and cute angels flying around with harps, because these are some serious cherubim, some serious angels. For starters, you'll notice in verse 5 that they have a human likeness, as they look kind of human, except that every one of them has 4 faces and 4 wings, with these wings which are so large that they're able to touch one another while holding up this expanse above their heads, as well as covering their own bodies, and also able to move in any and every direction very, very quickly and without having to turn themselves around. Now, the question, of course, is, are they real, or is this simply a symbolic vision? And to be perfectly honest, I don't really know. However, my suspicion is that they're real. One, because, well, they appear elsewhere in the Bible. But secondly, because look, I honestly believe that there are far more things which God has created which we haven't yet even seen, but we will one day. I mean, there are things in heaven and things outside of our present creation which we're yet to see and hear about. But just because we haven't yet seen them doesn't mean that they don't therefore exist. I think there's far more to the world and far more to creation that God has yet to reveal to us. Yeah, at the same time, there is something kind of symbolic about them, though, isn't there? For example, the repeated use of the number 4 is nearly always used within the Bible to refer to something which is universal. So, for example, even today, we talk about the 4 corners of the earth, or the 4 winds. And so here, the repeated use of 4 creatures with 4 faces and 4 wings, and then able to move quickly and easily in any direction, with God himself then enthroned or seated above them, seems to suggest, as it were, this God who is absolutely sovereign over all the earth and in any and every direction, to the 4 corners of the earth. This God is sovereign. But likewise, notice as well the 4 faces on each of these creatures, which seem to, I think, represent the 4 highest forms of life which are to be found in God's creation. So it's apocalyptic language, so it's using symbolism, but I think it's meant to represent something of God's sovereignty and rule over every aspect of his creation, every part of his creation. So firstly, mankind, the face of a man representing intelligence and rule over God's creation. So remember, the first man and woman made in the image of God and created by God in order to rule over his creation, but under him. Secondly, a lion, the king of the beasts, first among the wild animals, representing ferocity, as it were. Or an ox, thirdly, representing strength, the first among the domestic animals, as it were. And then, fourthly, an eagle, representing freedom, first among the birds of the air. So you've got the wild animals, the domestic animals, you've got the birds of the air, and you've got men and women. But either way, with a real or symbolic or some kind of mixture of both, the point is that God rules over and above every part of his creation. He causes all of it to serve him, whether that be on the earth in terms of governments and kings and nations and peoples, whether we're talking about above the earth and in heavenly places, or whether we're talking about under the earth. The thing is that all things are created by him, through him, and for him. All things exist in order to serve him, whether that be willingly or unwillingly. And so what Ezekiel sees is a God who is moving quickly and in any direction that he wants, and which can also be seen, as it were, in the second part of this vision, as Ezekiel sees what he describes as being wheels within wheels, and then eyes which are able to see in any direction throughout the earth, so that nothing is hidden from his sight. In other words, what Ezekiel presents us with, as it were, is this a vision of God who is enthroned over and above all of creation, domestic, wild, the air, the men and women, a God who is sovereign over all things, always moving, always at work, and always seeing. So that little wonder, as the Bible tells us elsewhere, the eyes of the Lord move to and fro throughout the earth, that he may strongly support those whose hearts are fully his. Or as it puts it elsewhere, nothing is hidden from the sight of him, before whom we must one day stand for judgment. There is no escaping this God. He is everywhere, and he is all powerful. And there is not a part of his creation over which he does not rule with absolute power. What about this last part, though? Verses 26 to 28, towards the end of the passage, have a look at it with me. He goes on to tell us that, look, above the expanse of their heads, the four living creatures, there was the likeness of a throne in appearance like sapphire, and seated above the likeness of a throne was a likeness with a human appearance. And upward from what had the appearance of his waist, I saw, as it were, gleaming metal, like the appearance of fire enclosed all around. And downward from what had the appearance of his waist, I saw, as it were, the appearance of fire, and there was brightness around him, like the appearance of, get this, the bow, or the rainbow, which is in the clouds on the day of rain. So was the appearance of the brightness all around. Such was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord. When I saw it, I fell on my face, and I heard the voice of one speaking. Up until now, Ezekiel has only described the things which are under this expanse, almost as though he's afraid to look any higher. But now he finally does look up in order to try and describe this throne and the one who is seated upon it. In other words, he now tries to somehow describe God himself. And yet the only thing he can say is that, one, he saw someone or something with a human appearance, and two, which had the appearance of fire, and three, that such was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord, that when I saw it, I fell on my face, and I heard the voice of one speaking. Human appearance, the appearance of fire, an appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord. Now, what's he getting at here? I mean, what's he saying about the glory of the Lord? What is that? I mean, we sing about it, don't we? We sing, show us your glory, O Lord. We talk about it. But what does he mean when he says, such was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord? Well, the glory of God is something which is kind of hard to describe, but the best way I know of saying it is that the glory of God is the holiness or the perfection of God on public display. So let me back up for a moment. When we describe God as being holy, what we're saying is this. To be holy means to be absolutely perfect. It means God does not make mistakes. It means that God is perfect, thoroughly perfect in and of himself. He is without sin or fault. There's no mistake in who God is or in how God acts. To say that God is holy is to say that God is completely and utterly perfect in who he is and in everything that he does. So, for example, when we think about the attributes of God, every one of those attributes is perfect. So he is perfect in love. He is perfect even in his anger. So there's no sin in his anger. His anger is a perfect anger. He's perfect in knowledge. There's no lapse in what God does and doesn't know. He has perfect knowledge. He's perfect in justice, perfect in power, perfect in wisdom. He's perfect in all his plans. He's perfect in terms of his moral goodness and his righteousness, so that none of God's actions ever contradict his character or some other aspect of his nature. It's not as though you can somehow pit God's love against God's wrath, or God's power against God's whatever. Everything, every attribute of God is perfectly consistent with his character and his nature. But when you take all those things, all those different attributes of God, when you take them together, when you see all those things working perfectly together, when you see that, when you see God as the greatest and the most glorious or precious or valuable, the most worthy thing in all of creation, the one and only, so there's no one and nothing else like him. That is what it means to see the glory of God, the perfection of God. Now, what is the cause Ezekiel to see the glory of God, as it were, and likewise for us? Well, firstly, he sees God coming in a storm, and we know that this storm, it represents judgment. God is coming in order to judge the guilty and the weak, the wicked. And yet in verse 28, he also sees what appears to be a rainbow in the storm. Isn't that extraordinary? The reminder, as it were, right from Genesis, that although God judges the guilty and the wicked, he is also perfect in terms of his love and his faithfulness to his people. Secondly, he sees God as a consuming fire, which on the one hand is able to bring incredible destruction to that which is worthless, but at the same time is also able to purify and refine that which is valuable and precious. That's what fire does. You can use it to burn up the waste, and you can use it to refine that which is valuable and precious. Thirdly, he sees a God who is all-powerful, who rules over all things. He can do with his creation whatever he wants to. And this is extraordinary. I mean, this God who is all-powerful and who rules over all things is in one sense completely and utterly unapproachable, and yet at the same time is so close to his people that at the absolute lowest and most difficult time in his life, Ezekiel himself is able to say that the Lord was there. The unapproachable, all-powerful, ruling God was with me. In fact, one person put it this way. They said, it's a wonderful thing to be able to look back in times of crisis in our life and to say with hindsight that God was there. But it's better by far to be able to say in the moment that whether by faith or sight, that God is here, that he is on the throne, he rules over all circumstances, and that he will get me through this. And then fourthly, what Ezekiel doesn't yet know, but which is given to us to understand, is that the one whom Ezekiel sees as having the likeness of a man, the appearance of fire, and the appearance of the likeness of the glory of God is in fact none other than Jesus Christ himself. And yet here it is, several hundred years earlier, and yet this is precisely the way in which Jesus himself will be described in the New Testament, in particular in the book of Revelation. After having died for sin, raised from dead, ascended into heaven and seated at the right hand of God. This is how the risen and reigning Jesus is described. So I haven't got a slide for you, but let me read to you from Revelation chapter 1, starting in verse 12. The Apostle John writes of this risen Jesus. He says, then I turned to see the voice that was speaking to me, and on turning, I saw 7 golden lampstands, and in the midst of the lampstands, one like a son of man, clothed with a long robe and with a golden sash around his chest. The hairs of his head were white like wool, like snow. His eyes were like a flame of fire. His feet were like burnished bronze, refined in a furnace. And his voice was like the roar of many waters. In his right hand he held 7 stars. From his mouth came a sharp, 2-edged sword, and his face was like the sun shining in full strength. When I saw him, I fell at his feet as though dead. But he laid his right hand on me, saying, fear not, for I am the first and the last, the living and the living one. I died, and behold, I am alive forevermore, and I have the keys to death and Hades. Again, this is the description of Jesus, where after having died for our sin, then raised to life, ascended into heaven, seated at the right hand of God, this is the one who is coming again, according to the book of Revelation, in order that he might make all things new. And on that day, when he does that, we will see that storyline of the Bible brought to perfect fulfillment. God's people in God's place, under God's rule, within the kingdom of God. Not a garden, not an Old Testament promised land, which was filled with still with the presence of sin and fallen and broken people, but a new creation. A new creation. God's people in God's place, under God's rule, within his kingdom. I mean, this is the reason for which Jesus came into the world. As the New Testament puts it, Christ died for sins once for all, the righteous for the unrighteous, in order to bring us to God, to destroy the power of death, and to one day make all things new. And he will do it. According to the New Testament, in him, that is Jesus, the Word of God became flesh, made his dwelling amongst us, and we have seen his glory, says the Apostle John, the glory of the one and only who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. Now, this is how the Bible is going to end. This is what Ezekiel, even at this point, doesn't realize, but what he's looking forward to and longing for. Which brings us to this very last thing, namely that even though Ezekiel's vision begins with a storm, ultimately it finishes with a throne. I love this. It finishes with a throne, a picture of God on the throne. In the midst of this storm, God rules. It's as though to remind us that even in those times of greatest crisis and upheaval in our lives, God is still on the throne. He rules over all and in all and through all. So well may we say, our God reigns. Our God reigns. So again, whatever battle you're presently facing, this is the promise of God, that God is here. He is on the throne. He rules over all circumstances, and he will get you through this. That is his promise.